you related to the immigrant experience?
Both of my parents, of course, are immigrants. They both came from Laos, different cities, but basically, I believe around the late 1980s to 1990s, my parents had to flee the country due to war. And from there, like my father went to the Philippines and then got to come to America. My mom went to Thailand and got to come to America. So all of my immigrant experience has been through them and then other family who also had to leave, of course. And it's just backdated to about four generations now.
Since you are not an immigrant yourself, you had to look into your heritage.
Yeah.
What made you look into it, and was it easy for you?
It's really hard and I wish it was sooner. So I looked into my heritage more so when I hit my early 20s. And this was around actual 2020 with COVID, pandemic, everyone's quarantining. Of course, lots of social events were going on. And of course, we had like um, the Asians Not a Virus, Stop Asian Hate. And from there, I kind of witnessed the most anti Asian hate crimes and just being isolated and excluded the most in my lifetime. And when I went home to discuss it with my mom and my dad about how it was really hard to one, just go to work or school because I was an Asian American and how I was being treated, they responded to me with, that's not the worst of it. And so it kind of triggered wanting to know more and started a conversation for us, which is why I started learning about it, trying to get into activism. So from there, I started creating content about Lao culture. And so I created the hashtag like learn about Laos. And from that, I was using everything I learned from my mom and dad, my sister, and my grandma, and then expanded to other families, to the temple and our culture. And everyone is very interested in it, but it wasn't easy because there's no textbooks. I tried online resources and every site was different and it kind of all depended on like which religion you were or like if you're actually Lao or if you're Lao American. So it was kind of gathering all these different resources until there was a common ground before I can make content on it to know it was accurate.
I did a little research myself, and I realized like a lot of these narratives aren't coming from Lao people.
No.
And if they are coming from Lao people, it was almost like we were just repeating what America's narrative on us was. And it's hard to tell what the truth is. And that's why I know that it was really hard to uh to be neutral um about our own reason why we're here.
Yeah. That was the hard part about how everyone's like, go online and find sources that way. And I'm like, I could, but a lot of the authors online weren't Lao or Lao American, and it didn't feel right to use those sources because unless they like grew up and gave like a kind of a context, how would I know that was accurate if you weren't actually Lao? And so like, it's why I would have to go and fact check it. And then I'd go around, like, I spoke to monks at our temple, and even ones in my hometown kind of got their point of view because they're from Laos and then they come to the States. They learn both English and Lao, and they kind of get to see both communities of Lao Americans and those who are from Laos. And they were able to explain it a lot easier once I could get the translation. But of course, there's no books of it. So, like, they couldn't write it down for me. It's all through ear, and it's what I can write down and remember.
I love that you are interpreting what they are saying, because I mean the erasure of culture is really because we have seen what written language has done and how it's colonized. So since we don't really work off written language, we are just storytellers, um, community like engagement and things like that. That's how our community is based. You can always disagree or jump in if I'm saying something incorrectly. So it feels like Yeah, like what you're doing is putting us in the books. And I love that.
Yeah, that actually is the goal. If it's not me, I just want to at least inspire someone who actually gets to do it because, of course, not everyone gets the same opportunities. But the main purpose of everything is just to educate, learn, and inspire. So if I'm able to get anything about us as people, us as a culture or heritage in a book, in any kind of education format, then I succeeded.
Yeah, I love that. And people are learning so much, even though we're just talking a little bit about it. It doesn't seem like we're going in too deep, but people are already learning so much because really, I mean, we know the Vietnam War happened, but
Yes.
how does Laos play a role? And it plays a huge, significant role
Oh,
in
yeah.
both Laos and America. And we're not even in the books, but when we like Memorial Day just passed, and I have this duality where, of course, we are, remembering the fallen soldiers in America, but then my heart is like, well, our people were really affected, like civilians and soldiers, and we're affected politically and all of that. So I just, learning to hold both of those narratives in my body and knowing that they're both true. And it's not just like one sided is really hard for us when we start to dig into the truth, right?
Yeah, we've had to be very open-minded and very forgiving, which it's a little frustrating because, of course, like we're forgiving, but not necessarily the person who caused the harm at a whole is being self-forgiving or at least accountable. I've done a lot of work with World War II veterans who recognize me for being Laos. And of course, I'm like, oh no, like I'm Lao American. Like I fix it to those they don't know if I'm from the country or not. But I was like, but my parents are from Laos. Like that's why we're in the States now. And like the first thing they always do is apologize. And as a kid, I didn't get that. But as an adult, I was like, oh, I know why you're apologizing. And people don't recognize that. And then Memorial Day, which just passed, like we're torn because we want to celebrate it. Like I know in Minnesota, there's the foundation and like groups and communities about Lao soldiers. And I thought that was very sweet and touching.
Mm.
So it's kind of finding that white line because in any way, shape, or form, you were in the military and you served, you did what you were told. You may not have known the root of it, or you may have. And it's kind of finding out the truth of it later after the fact. And you can't change it from that point on.
Yeah. And then to stand by what you did,
Mm-hmm.
whether you agreed or not agree with it, is uh, it's just like this is like the complexity of life and the nuance of, being involved in these events. That I think sometimes we forget that there are so many reasons, perspectives, and angles that we can look at it, and to not hold like one perspective above all is really hard because we're also living in America and we're meant to celebrate, um, you know uh, just America's loss or gains.
Yeah. I've seen it firsthand with my family about um when some of our family members wanted to join military services and first reaction off the bat was like, why? Like you know exactly what they're gonna do. And of course, it took lots of explanation and just kind of leaning them into the process of like, it's not like that anymore. Hopefully, it's going to be different. And if it were to arise again, the situation can be done differently. And just in my family alone, because of course, not many people understand. Like when I say my family, some of us aren't even blood related. It's kind of like I have family who took in my father and like quote unquote adopted him so he could come to the States. And so like we call them family. Like I will call them grandpa, but they're not really my grandpa. And so like I got to see those kinds of families have their inner turmoil with some service members who were like, yeah, I'm joining the army, the navy. And they're like, why? You know exactly what they're going to do. Like, do you not understand why we came here? It's because this quote unquote certain branch coming during the war. And it's just, it's interesting to see the change over time of how they can come to an understanding that um, now that they've been in the States, it's not necessarily the whole entire case that all military are bad. It's just again propaganda because they have it over where they are and they've seen it in the US when they arrive and they're just unsure what's the safest option.
Yeah. We don't even know propaganda is happening, right?
Mm-mm.
So, which leads us into the reason why we're even having this discussion, and I can't wait to dig in, is you chose graphic design, and that led you into looking into art and propaganda. So tell
Yeah.
us that journey, how it started, and like what's so interesting, or what do we need to know about it?
It's been really fun. So, of course, like I chose to go into a career of graphic design. So, I'm studying graphic design. People may not know, but like it includes web design, it includes, of course, styles of art, history of art. And when I was doing history of art, I got to learn different art styles. One of them mainly was propaganda. And that was a really interesting chapter because the class is very discussion based and the teacher selects all the artwork that we're doing discussions on. One of them happened to be um, one against Japanese groups. But of course, at the time it was at, which was like the 1970s to 80s, you can understand like that's wartime. It was very US oriented about like, let's defeat the Japs. And I got to see like some people purposely avoid talking about that piece because they weren't sure what to accurately say without showing a form of bias. You're supposed to critique the piece as an artist and not as someone who agrees with the political point of view. And so, because some people couldn't differentiate that, they avoided that piece of art. And I didn't. Like, I talked about the color, the choice of scheme, how they angled everything. And the teacher noticed because we didn't discuss race and we didn't have profile photos. And so, I remember messaging her saying, like, I don't mind that there's a variety and diversity of art. I just see a lot of anti Asian art. And
Mm.
as a preface, I am Asian American with immigrant parents. Is there a reason there's only anti Asian art? And she only explained to me that it was due to the time period because we were doing certain eras. And it kind of clicked. I was like, oh, okay, this is the time during the war when we're against a lot of the Asian areas and or quote the US is like we're saving some of the Asian areas. And from there, like she told us to look into other art pieces. So I got to kind of see the scholarly art files of a lot of different anti-Asian pieces, and none really were shown of like any of the marginalized community countries with US propaganda. It was just all US propaganda against Asian groups. And it was interesting because I was like, why is there no data collection of the opposite side? It's just propaganda against Asians because of the war. Like there's two sides to every story, but I was only seeing one for class. And it just kind of triggered how if we're not there, we don't get to see it. Like there's no online archive, there's no scholar archive. And like I'm in college and university and they don't have access to it. It's very fascinating. Like it still felt very controlled that I couldn't find what I was needing to find. And as someone who did graphic design, like I almost even did propaganda art for like military branches. So I looked at it and I was like, I could literally just make a piece right now, anonymously post it and see if it like goes somewhere and if it makes it somewhere. But I don't think anyone will try and archive it for a reason.
Hmm.
And so
So
looking at art, it's very interesting here. It feels very one-sided.
what makes art? I mean, there's art, right? And then there's
Mm-hmm.
like propaganda art. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What makes it propaganda?
Usually, well, like now it's so modern, but usually, like in that time period, it's always like 2D. There's a certain kind of style that looks like pop art. So, vibrant colors, you can see primary colors like royal blue, red, lots of black, thick strokes around to add depth. And you just know it's propaganda art because it's one group towards one group. And the one like I always saw was like US towards Japan or US towards China. And of course, like that's one of the major ones my dad remembers seeing when he came to the States. He's like, yeah, there's like billboards and posters like US against China. And then everyone looks at you. And he would always be like, it doesn't matter if I argue that I'm not Chinese. They already have it in their mind that I am. And I was like, but you're not, dad. And like to have that everywhere against you, it feels unsafe. But yeah, propaganda art usually is just like the intent to show one group over the other. It's just kind of like a comparison. There's always two subjects involved, and it's either bringing them together or separating them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not just like it's like has an intention to
Yeah.
have you think a certain way, right?
Yeah. We see it all the time in the news. It's really hard. Like, since everything growing up, like my turning point was COVID-19 and quarantine, and like the news had all propaganda in it, and they don't realize it. It's always like, oh, us against the riots, us against the government, this group in the Capitol, or like this ethnic group and this ethnic group. Because at one point, I remember they tried to pin marginalized communities against each other. So it was like Black lives, Asian lives, and then I think like Latinx or Hispanic lives, because they were trying to just make sure we didn't group together and work together. And like that's propaganda on its own without even making it artwork. It's just
Mm.
verbalizing it. So it happens everywhere around us and we don't kind of realize it unless it's drawn out. And I feel like nowadays, because we are so prone to one, call it out and or blow it up and have that kind of cancel culture, that they don't do propaganda art as much, but they still have propaganda speak.
Mm. Definitely. And if you're only hearing and over one propaganda over another, it almost becomes your evidence, right? Well,
Yeah,
if 1,000 people or every channel says it, then it must be true, right? They
exactly.
are the authority. So it's like authority giving you a narrative. So why would you go against what we see as neutral news sometimes, which is rarely because they're all, uh, owned by somebody. Um, like, can we trust news? Can we trust the media?
It's hard. It's undoubtedly trying to create a hive mind. And like I've seen it in my own family. Like my mother watches the news still because she trusts it as a source. And like I'll come over and she'll repeat it back. I'm like, oh no, mom, like that's not true. And she'll like, but it was on the news. I'm like, yes, like it was on the news, but you have to like fact check it now. Like you got to make sure that it's not like towards one side or the other. Like you need to form your own opinion. You cannot just believe what they are telling you because that's what they want you to do. They don't want you to question against their point of view. And if you do, they'll make sure to like not let you find those resources so you can just agree with their point of view. And that's what happened with me all the way up until my turning point in creating all of my content pages, because my parents had me in the mindset of like, it's fine, you're American, like you will not be isolated. You will not have any hate crime. Like, you're good. You speak English, you're fluent, you have no accent, you're not going to get discriminated. And that's what I felt for the longest time until COVID-19 came out and they're like, it's from China. And the next thing you know, it was like every Asian is Chinese. I went to work and everyone was avoiding me because they're like, we don't want the Chinese girl to help me. And it's just wow.
We were literally forced to look at ourselves. And we were forced to possibly see ourselves, for me in my experience, see myself as not actually as privileged as I thought I was.
Yeah.
And it really hurt when to realize you thought you were outside of this, meaning like you weren't a racist, you're good people, and to realize like we're all part of this propaganda that is fueling our separation from each other. And I want to talk about what you kind of dabbled in a little bit about the savior, how America's going to save everyone in Asia, because that really burns. That burns a lot because before they save you, something has to be wrong, right? And it's a bunch of propaganda. And even though, like you said, you're asking your parents and your family members and the monks, I feel like when I do that, it's all the same narrative. It's American narrative given to Asian people. And at first, I really bought into it until Black Lives Matter and the
Mm-hmm.
COVID, and I really bought into it as well. And then I'm realizing, like, shoot, we need to look at multi-dimensional stories of our life, like who's telling it, do our own research. And I don't mean to say like do your own research as but I mean like really look at historical research and see the patterns. And yeah, that white savior complex is it's plaguing our authenticity because we give the authority away, and uh, we owe America almost anything they want, and
But
we give
they,
it all up.
yeah, it is a very much a white savior complex because I'm like, we don't owe them anything. When you look at history, I'm like, they caused many countries to get to a point of needing that assistance, of needing that kind of saving. And that's why they do it. So we become so codependent that we need their access to certain like medical assistance and just resheltering, and in return for that saving, we learn their language, we go to their country, we become one of them, but then still get mistreated because we obviously aren't one of them. And so, like with America and like the US just saying, oh, yeah, like we welcome everyone, like we're so diverse. And you see there's so many different groups. It looks that way. But when you're in it, it's absolutely not that. Because even as an Asian American, I get told by others, like I have privilege. I'm like, of course, I acknowledge I have more privileges than my parents ever did. But like if I were to view my privilege to maybe people in my age group of different ethnic groups, I would be in one of the lower areas. And people kind of don't think about that because it's all mindset. And I don't know, just the white supremacy always, it frustrates me so much because someone has to be very open-minded to hear about it per se. Like you can't argue and convince someone about it. They have to first acknowledge and understand it does exist to have this conversation, or it will go nowhere. Because in my father and my mother had two different versions of why they came to the States. And like my dad was like, oh, because of the military, like they thought Laos was bad. And then my mom was like, oh, because we wanted freedom. And that's how you know like who got what side of propaganda and who got to see what side of reality. My dad knew exactly why he was coming to the States, because if he didn't, there was a chance he wouldn't be able to survive and live. My mom was under the impression that like America had saved her family and she got to come here on a great opportunity. And I'm like, no, mother, they literally starved you of anything to survive. So you chose that option. Like there was the bombings, there was the war, there was lack of resources because you no longer had water or food. Of course, with the bombings, there's no longer homes. Grandpa, your father, was doing the best he could at the time. And by doing that, he took you to a camp that would take you to the States. And she never got to kind of confront that because my grandpa passed away. And when I brought it up and then opened the conversation with my dad explained it to her. And she then understood and she goes, that explains a lot. I'm like, yes. And it's really sad that at this point in time in your life, as someone past your 50s, that you're having to relearn this from the true point of view.
Hmm. Yeah. One event and multiple perspectives, multiple feelings. And it really has divided our community because some buy into it, some have their own. And I will say back then, if I asked my dad the same question, it has changed now because of even more like propaganda or influence other people have had. And I always want to be um like I wish they knew how to Google and look things up. I don't want to be the one always educating or telling them or, watch out or, be careful or that's not always true. There's always another side. Like I don't want to be the teacher all the time.
Yes.
Um, because then it's just like they're not listening to me anyways, right? They have their own minds and they've lived their own experience. So it's hard. Definitely hard. But let's go back to the propaganda piece. You have
Yeah.
some art that you want. I'm
Yes.
going to give you the screen and I'm going to, how do I switch? How do I give you access? Okay, there you go. You can have access to the screen and show us some examples of propaganda and art.
Okay. It may be a little blurred, so I might lower it. Are we able to see this image?
Yeah, I think we see it good enough.
Okay. It's very pixelated, of course, because this was from one of my scholar sites, but it's a very small image because at the time they didn't do like 8 by 11 art pieces. But I think I even referenced this earlier when they reference to Japan or Japanese, they say Jap. That's not necessarily polite. They know it's not polite, but it says salvage scrap to the blast, the Jap. And of course, we know history and what we had done to Japan with the bombings. And people are like, but we had to do that. Like, you learn that in school and the history behind it. I'm like, yes, of course. And there's always times where we can openly admit that other countries aren't doing the greatest things to the US, and the US doesn't do the greatest things to other countries. But I only point this out because this is around the 1970s, is the back date of the poster.
Hold
And
on. I'm gonna 1 second. I just because it's gonna be a pod. Can you explain what you see?
yeah,
Okay.
so I had to do research for this. But of course, it's
Like,
pixelated, but there's a snake. It says occupied territory, and the cap is supposed to have like a Japanese like flag or symbol. So that's supposed to represent Japan. And the eagle is the US. There's a star. They didn't really reference why there was a star, but when we studied this in class, the teacher said to try and create some kind of symbolism. And a lot of classmates were like, oh, the eagle's the US because like we pride for the bald eagle. And I was like, okay, that's a good reference to click together. And they're like, yeah, like the bomb is like we're dropping a bomb on Japan. And I was like, very, very clear in that image. Yes, you can see a missile. It's coming from the talons. There's motion lines from the eagle's talons to the snake. And it's kind of just like when it says blast the Jap, I'm like, okay, well, like it's very literal. We all know the historic timeline of what happened with the bombings, but when is this okay to just create a poster about it? And I think the artist who had created it was just very celebratory of US's dominance shown in the activities behind that historic event. And I can understand to a certain point. I haven't done more Japan history research because I dedicated most of it to Lao. But if we went back into the time about why Japan was being so problematic, in quote, for the US to bomb them, it could have a second side to it. But it's the fact that this came out after all of those events and it was celebratory of what they did, even though we know very much how many people were killed, um, even if there were survivors, and how it impacted Japan for the rest of their historic timeline. Because there's many people who are like, I don't have certain family members because they're in this region who got bombed. And it's just interesting when you're in the US and you see a poster like this and they're like, yeah, we bombed someone. Like we did
Right.
it. We bombed this group. We bombed this country. And I'm like, how your first question is how is it celebratory? And so the propaganda here is to kind of convince those who are able to see it, who are American, that the actions done were good,
Mm.
even if deadly,
Hmm.
which is tricky from my point of view, because when you have a history and know a history about like, oh yeah, like it was deadly, but it needed to happen. Did it really need to happen? Versus like someone who is American has that background would be like, yeah, like they were causing issues. They absolutely deserved it. And I'm over here like, do they really deserve it though? And they're like, yeah, of course, this, and this. And I'm like, but where'd you get those points? Like XYZ, where'd you get those? Oh, I heard it. Uh-huh. And where's that source from? And like it's all this propaganda, or like Japan is taking our resources. Japan is going to attack us. We need to blast the Jap. And so that was one of the pieces I had to critique. The teacher never really gave us an actual background. She just kept letting us have conversation. But I feel like I was the only one kind of instigating, like, why do you think that? And it's why like that class what got so draining for me to a certain point. Like it was a great experience, but it was really like heartbreaking to see that I was the only one kind of questioning why. Now that I'm
Mm.
grown, because I've gone through the US education system, I remember learning about the bombing. And all I learned growing up was that, quote unquote, Japan needed to get bombed. And I never really got to question why.
Yeah, which leads America to have their internment camp. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, be okay with dehumanizing just regular whether they're citizens or just humans who are not even part of the war, maybe or may not. And not everybody was Japanese. And we just get confused. Whatever anti-Asian propaganda, we all get clustered into it.
Yeah. And like,
And there's so many countries, though.
it's the scarier part that they can't even take the time to differentiate. Because, of course, I've been called Japanese, Chinese, um, Vietnamese. It's like any of the main areas that they know. And then you think back to like historical conflict and you always see like Japan, China, and Vietnam. So at first I thought it was because they didn't want to bother differentiating us, but really they're just grouping us into one of the regions they've had historic conflict with.
Right.
but not, they don't
It,
think about the other little regions around that got impacted.
Mhm.
But
I have a thought on nationality, but I
mm,
want you to go on to and explain your next art piece.
sure. Oh, this one's a lot more resolution. So this one's newer. This one was actually for World War II,
Mm,
which hits more home for me and us. But
yeah. I mean,
of,
it's interesting because yeah, I mean, Japanese occupied Laos, and then America just had their hands all over it.
yeah,
And, but knowing recently that the CIA has been involved uh, in Laos and barely getting recognized for, um, no, any accountability, any bomb cleanup is like, we're only going to continue the single narrative. And it really, really hurts. But also, I love that you are bringing this up because, um, you know, people, when we're looking at this, we only see that, yes, the eagle is doing a really good thing. And we buy into it because my dad told me a story. He was like, um, he says, this is recently, and he's gone a little far right. He says that the reason why they were America treated him so good versus you know the communists was because the communists would give him food in the refugee camp that was like crap, and then for the Americans would give him Ovaltine, which is really good stuff. And we grew up on that. I'm just like those little things, those micro little things have really started to condition him, just good or bad. And I wish he held uh his original stance of like understanding both and the complexities of war. But yeah, I mean, giving him old opening, that's what he remembered and how America treated him so good in the refugee camps. And I'm just like, wow, that's how easy it is to influence our parents.
yeah, it was like I see it now still, like how we're raised to be grateful for anything given. And I can see it referencing back to that because my mother had the camp that wasn't, of course, as nice, but of course, kinder. And so she did receive food. Like she would tell me about how she got rice and sometimes I think chicken. Um, it was some kind of protein with the rice, but of course, it was still very limited. You could still classify it as starving because it maybe was one meal a day if they were lucky. But my father went to the camp where they didn't give food, so he was very skinny. Um, and it was kind of just like watching people collapse or pass away before he could even get the chance to get on a plane to come to the States. So my dad was like, they didn't give us anything. And that's what the US is like. They're not going to give you anything to get an advancement. And I've kind of like taken from that because it's been very true from what I've seen. And I've been frustrated with it. Like as I got into college, that I wouldn't get a sort of placement for having the same kind of criteria or GPA as someone else. And you hate to bring it back to being Asian, but it just seems that way because they claim diversity, but then there's no like ethnic group of scholars or like the top 10 in the class isn't ever anyone of color, but we all have the same grades, take the same classes, apply to the same scholarships. And everyone's like, well, this person just had more of this. And I'm like, did they have more of this or do they fit your agenda? So it's kind of just my mom really appreciated what she was given and she told me to always appreciate whatever you're given because of how she's treated in the camp versus my dad was like no matter what's handed out to you like you don't owe anything and they should be giving you that bare minimum to survive.
Mm. Yeah, even our parents are in opposite sides of, um, I guess, their level of appreciation and how they see life. And with your college and your school, I always get people telling me how affirmative action is helping people of the global majority, people of color. And, when we actually do the research and look at the data, because white women are also considered marginalized because they're women, it comes, it's the data shows that white women have had the most benefits out of affirmative action. So
Yeah.
that's something that we really have to, it's an easy, it seems like it was intended for people of color, but those who benefited are still white women.
Yeah.
So it's just something that we always have to do, and look in it a little deeper after the propaganda and the talking points are pushed onto us.
Yeah. And like just a sidebar, I've only done this research because it was graduation season. But basically women of color graduating with a bachelor degree because extensive education, they don't have stats for associate degrees, which I'm upset about because those are just as important. But for bachelor degrees in women of color, it's about 1.9% across all groups getting to that point of graduation. And I thought that was astounding because I saw a girl put a stat on a video. She was like, I am now a part of that percent. And I was just like, wait, like I thought that was so much bigger. So like I kept researching into other groups and like I looked at Asian American stats. And of course that included men. So like I slimmed it down to Asian American women, and then it went down to Laotian American women. And for Asian American women, it's 19% gets a bachelor degree. And I'm like, okay, it's a higher number, but it's not even 20%. It's not even a quarter. But everyone's like, you see everyone, like they're so smart, like that stereotype of Asians. And like they're always getting degrees, yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, okay, but women who are Asian or Asian American and getting a bachelor degree is at 19% as of 2022 because the census hasn't been done yet. And I'm like, that's still a very small number because if you look at white or American bachelor degree stats, they're in the 70 to 80%. And they're like, well, like it like I don't understand why you're upset. I'm like, well, you talk about us having privilege, being Asian American, yet our numbers aren't the same. It's not a population thing. It's a ratio. And so if they're having 70 to 80% of a bachelor degree graduation rate and we're at a 19%, there's something there. And it could have something to do with anyone dropping out for personal reasons like family. It could be funds because college is expensive and it becomes overwhelming. There's loan debt where you can't pay it back. It's just not everyone has the opportunity to just go through college and pay it off later. And so graduation rates for people of color and women of color are much lower. And scholarships are seen and granted. I like to think that we like to publicize whenever it happens to show that we can get them, but it doesn't mean that the number is high of who's receiving it. And so it's really tough to see that because I'm trying to join that percentage. And like I'm talking about graphic design and I'm talking about all the art styles I had to study. And I'll still get questioned on my credibility. But if I were, per se, a white woman, my credibility wouldn't be questioned once I
Mm.
say I'm getting a bachelor degree. But I found like even now, and I'm like, yes, I'm Asian American, I'm Laotian American. I'll be like, yeah, I'm going to school for art. I've studied a lot of art history. I've done psychology. I've done writing in English. I've very much diversified my educational standpoint to be well equipped, even though many people just stick to one degree and just graduate. I've done a variety and I've found my way to graphic design, and it doesn't take away my credibility in other areas I've studied before this, but they'll still question me.
Yeah. It's I was talking about this the other day, how um we are not the authority in our, I want to say, even family and society. But yeah, a white man does not even get, he doesn't get doubted. What he says is truth, and what he says is, you know, right. You don't even Google that to just double check him. While everything we say is like one eye up and are you sure? And it's hard because you're always in defense mode every time you speak of anything that is out of the ordinary. And I always find that women, we know the truth, like in our body. Like, we know how to listen to our intuition, and
Yes.
we are very intuitive. While men, they're controlling the world, but it's not really it's not really benefiting us. Yet we just
Mhm.
continue to give them the authority, and we continue to believe everything they say. And that's really disheartening. And I'm really sorry that you're still not seen as a credible source, when you speak of, even, whether it's your lived experience or your parents' lived experience. You're still not seen as a credible source about your experience.
Yeah. The goal with my content creation is just to be a credible source for people, hopefully younger than me, so they don't have to come to this point as late as I felt I came into it. But I even the piece I'm sharing, I wanted to recreate it because it says, "Is this tomorrow?" And I kind of want to interject our own situations right now.
Mm,
But this topic only remains relevant because it didn't attack a certain group per se. But once you read communism, people always have a group that comes to mind. And it's just interesting because communism didn't just exist in China. It didn't just exist in certain regions. Like Laos was about to under reign communism, and it did go under it, and then it went back to different parties depending on who ruled. But when they say, "Is this tomorrow?" My first question was, why is there no question mark?
mm.
But it's showing like the US going up in flames because communism is so bad. It's the worst possible outcome in their mind. And of course, you can see like the conflict between each subject underneath. And I love that they chose people of color to
Mhm.
who they were arguing with in the piece. And in my class, no one kind of um, pointed it out, versus I was over here like, you can obviously see the skin tones are different. Every person's a different ethnic group. And then the Americans all look the same. Why is it that they're fighting each other? Is there communism in each area? Are they for communism, against communism? And what I found frustrating was, even in school, they never really explained what communism was. And if they did, they never reaped the benefits of communism or the negatives. It was just negative, negative, negative. And there's some areas that do really well with it. I'm not saying I'm pro for it, but I'm just saying when you read communism, it was always, it's awful, it's bad, it's the end all be all. We cannot have communism. And that was a lot of propaganda for war because, of course, they're like, we had to bomb Laos. Like they were pro communism, but they, like, even my dad to say, like, we didn't want communism. That's why we came to the States. So, how is it pro if everyone fleeing also doesn't want communism? And then there's Vietnam with the Vietnam War, and they're like, yeah, communism, like, but where? And like, do you know what communism is? Like, there's active groups in the countries who may have been for communism and aiming to take over the country to have it, but it didn't mean the whole region wanted it. It just meant there was a possible threat of it. So you should have isolated that threat and fought that threat instead of spreading it to a whole country and harming the
Mm.
whole country.
Yeah, it's a continuous propaganda. I think uh, we can talk about this. I'm not a political science major, but definitely communism has worked against the Black community. It has worked against the Asian community. It has worked against the Hispanic communities. Um, it just is a word, a buzzword that gets essentially everyone. It just it's a buzzword that we don't even give a second chance, and we don't even take a look at it to see what parts of it may be good. Um, and I also notice that people are moving into these communist countries for retirement in the news, and a lot of Americans are moving to, you know, uh, countries like Vietnam for retirement because they can't afford capitalism anymore. And it's like now our privilege as Americans with American dollars are going over there and leveraging that. And it's like, when will we stop? When will we actually like find what's good about democracy and the good about even communism? Because I mean, why would you be over at a communist country, if you didn't benefit off of it? So I always feel like we are not even scratching the surface of a possibility, because we're like, hell no to communism all the way, 1000%. And it's like, come on, guys, look at our democracy right now. Like, children are dying, people are homeless or houseless. The average American is living paycheck to paycheck. Like, come on, like, let's see what is between the two extremes or the two ideologies. Um, we're just in a place where we're not having these discussions, and I'm so thankful. I do want to describe this poster. It
Sure.
says there's a flag and there's fire in front of it, and there are people. There's the main people are there's six of them. There's clearly soldiers. Um, it looks like communist soldiers, harming one
Civilians.
person, and then also there are people of color in there. That there's just a lot of conflict in humanity in front of the flag and the fire. And it
Mhm.
says, "Is this tomorrow?" And then it says, "America under communism." So it really is just like a fear of communism, really. And no matter who you are, you have to fear it, which is why we cannot talk about the possibility of anything good about it, because really it's what's similar to communism. What I know is unions, and unions rely on the power of the people, and many people rely on unions to have their backs, and really it's like the mobilization uh of communities, of like us owning our rights to production. So there are things out there that I want to look at more. um Anyways, tell me if I'm wrong.
Oh
Tell
no,
me
you're
if I yeah.
you're very much there. Like the propaganda, a lot of propaganda is fear tactic. So this was the fear tactic, like, oh my gosh, like, is this what you want? Because we're going this road. And there's no way I could possibly tell if we were actually going that road or if they finally received some kind of lashback for their actions. And they're trying to be like, okay, so like we struck them once, they struck us back. Are we going to be under communism? Is this our tomorrow? And so it's just kind of like fear implementations for the hive mind to panic. And of course, I saw this firsthand with COVID-19, the whole like people are passing away, like we need to stay inside, wear a mask. And then we had some people who did not want to wear a mask. And they're like, are you going to give in and be scared of going outside and breathing air? And I'm like, it's not breathing air, it's catching a virus. But
Yeah.
like that's how I compare it to this poster, this flyer, because like, is this tomorrow? And everyone's like, do you want this forever? Like, when is this mask going to get lifted? And I'm like, well, if you wore it more often, it might go away faster. but it's definitely accurate. When you mentioned union, I was like, yes, like union in workplaces can very much be beneficial or it can be very negative. It all depends. And I think the biggest thing I've heard about like union workplace is that people complain about all the money that gets taken out of their check or how much they had to pay to union. But no one complains about it if they stay with union long enough to like retire and all the amounts they
Mm,
get back. They only complain about it in the moment when they're young or they're very new to the company. But I was just like, how do you not know that it's not the same? Like, how do you not know the benefits don't stack up like this if a small country were to be communist? Because it's certain ways of running an area and a group of people can be different depending on population size, how diverse that area is, and just an equal understanding of mind. I feel like in the US, of course, the reason they were so negative towards communism is because we're such a bigger group. And we've now reached a point that it's hard to just control all of us. And at this point, democracy is kind of like there, but not there. So if we were to become communism, like communistic, it would be very difficult. But like for small areas, like a lot of Asian countries that they kept pointing it towards, or even like African countries, it's a little easier because the population is not as high and or they can break it up by city or by province. So no one talks about the benefits to all these fear tactics they put into these certain groups. I'm like, I've had friends, of course, who are from China, and they're like, yeah, like could only have one kid. I was the only kid. Like we were in communism. I got to come here to travel abroad. It's very different. I can see the benefits to being in a democratic area versus a communistic area. But then they're like, it's really expensive here. Like I had to keep asking my parents to send me money versus like at home, this would have lasted me the whole month and all that. And I'm just like, people don't think about that. And then you hear about folks retiring and going to those countries and or having like vacation homes there to summer
mhm,
there and all that. And I'm like, okay, so it's no longer negative because you can have benefits, but
mhm.
you don't mention those benefits before when you're pinning them against a certain ethnic group who had already originally lived there. It was kind of putting a fear tactic in to bring us over so they can have more profit and capitalism.
Yeah, it's all capitalism, and
Yeah.
it's the capitalism is like the shiny new gadget that you want, but you don't really need.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so what else? Is there anything on your journey that you are like itching for us to know about?
I don't feel like I know anything like on the top of my head. I just know that with the journey, it's hard. It's kind of just like not trying to be only angry and frustrated. It's because I had to learn to be very forgiving, and I'm still forgiving as I learn more information now that I've expanded it to other areas. And it's why like I wished this type of educational information was offered to me when I was younger, because as an adult you're already wired a certain way, which is what they wanted. So when you have to stop and relearn, it gets frustrating. And when you're younger, it's a little easier just to absorb that information and adjust as you go versus learning one way, a certain way, and then having to stop and readjust and learn as an adult because the information was incorrect. And the point of my material that I post is just to offer that source to anyone who's curious. That way, they have a safe place to discuss and ask questions and learn, because I didn't feel safe to ask questions until all those events happened and I started asking my parents. And at that point in time, I was around 21. And to put an age difference, I'm now 24. And for many people by 21, they may or may not have been graduating college or finishing college. I'm currently finishing college. And so I feel like this is something people should be confident and assured of before they're 18 and graduating high school. But that's not happening. And when I started creating my content, a lot of kids from middle school to high school were interacting with it. And they're like, I have to ask my history teacher the next time I go back to class because we didn't learn this. And I kind of love hearing that because every time I questioned my timeline, I reflect back and all of my history teachers and history professors would one always ask if I was Lao, and then they would explain the timeline to me, and I'd bring it back to my dad. And he's like, "Oh yeah, that's very true. Like you have a good teacher." And I feel like because of academic systems and the criteria they had to teach, they don't mention it, but the history teachers know.
Yeah.
Like they know it happened. They're very much aware. I feel like it's impossible to have gone to that kind of teaching level and not have learned it. So when kids are asking them, it starts a conversation. And even when I was in history class in college, I would always try to bring it back to that. And a lot of kids, of course, normal reaction I even get on social media is like, oh, this again, like we get it. And I'm like, do you though? Do you actually get it? Because this is not in a textbook. This is not online to Google. This is not on Quizlet. This is from the source of the people who went through the impact because we don't have a textbook. We don't have a presentation. We don't have a museum. We don't have anything dedicated. We don't have a memorial. And they're just like, oh, I'm like, yeah, like the only source you have of this being true is me and the history teacher who's backing me up right now. So do you really get it? Like I keep bringing it up over and over because there's no physical proof of what we went through besides the people who went through it. And of course, over time, those people are going to pass away and it's only going to live through our generation.
Yeah. We have to build upon what we're doing and have these relationships and pass it to other people. I just had a presentation with Sunisa about Lao, and yeah, it's got to come out of us, our brains, our thoughts on paper or on the screen, and then shared. It has to be shared. And of course, like you said, it has to be shared in open-minded space because that's the safest for us, right?
Yeah, the website I created because when my content got to that point where social media captions weren't long enough, I made a website. And so there's like a discussion forum for people who want to ask questions. There's like Discord options, there's comments, and there's different articles on different things. I've expanded past just learn about Laos, and I've talked about like China. I've talked about Lunar New Year, and I just plan to do more. Hopefully, those articles can get published. I'm working on that just because I feel like there needs to be publication of this information. But I'm going through my self citation process because, again, since we don't originally have books, I just want to verify my information before I put it out there. Because, unlike some educational systems, I want it to be true.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so proud of what you're doing.
Thank you. It was an honor being here, and I love talking to you.